I've always been a light sleeper. Every creak, every groan of the house wakes me up. Living alone in an old cabin in the woods doesn't help much either. I moved here after retiring from my job as a mechanic, thinking the solitude would be peaceful, and for a while, it was. Just me, my tools, and the occasional visit from my daughter when she could make the trip. But lately, things have been different. It started a few weeks ago. I was sitting in my living room, reading a book, when I heard a knock at the door. It was late, well past midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I froze, listening. The knock came again, louder this time. I grabbed the flashlight I keep by the couch and went to the door. When I opened it, there was no one there. Just the empty woods stretching out into the darkness. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight around, but saw nothing. The air was still, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I told myself it was probably just the wind or some animal brushing against the door and went back inside. The next night, I was woken up by a sound. It was faint at first, like a soft tapping. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the window in the kitchen. I grabbed the flashlight again and crept down the hall. When I reached the kitchen, the tapping stopped. I stood there in the dark, staring at the window, but there was nothing there. Just my reflection staring back at me. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows before going back to bed, but I didn't sleep much that night. A few days later, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were small, like a child's, and they led from the edge of the woods to my front porch. I don't get visitors out here, and my daughter hadn't been by in months. I followed the tracks as far as I could, but they disappeared into the trees. I told myself it was probably just some kids messing around, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and they were coming from inside the house. My heart was pounding as I reached for the flashlight. I didn't have a weapon, but I grabbed the heavy wrench I keep by the bed for emergencies. I stepped out into the hallway, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The footsteps stopped. I stood there listening, but the house was silent. I checked every room, every closet, but there was no one there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next few nights were quiet, but I couldn't relax. I started locking my bedroom door at night, something I'd never done before. I even considered calling my daughter, asking her to come stay with me for a while. But I didn't want to worry her. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head. Then, last night, I woke up to the sound of laughter. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was coming from inside the house. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the cabin. It sounded like a child, but there was something off about it, something unnatural. I grabbed the wrench and the flashlight and unlocked the bedroom door. The laughter stopped as soon as I stepped into the hallway. I shone the flashlight around, my hands shaking, but there was nothing there. When I reached the living room, I saw it. A figure standing in the corner, just barely visible in the dim light. It was small, like a child, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it watching me. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced myself to move. I raised the wrench, ready to defend myself, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, but when I finally blinked, the figure was gone. I searched the entire cabin, but there was no sign of it. I didn't sleep at all last night. I sat in the living room with the lights on, the wrench in my lap, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I don't know what's going on, but I can't stay here much longer. The cabin doesn't feel like home anymore. It feels wrong. I've started packing my things, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever it is, it won't let me leave. I'll send an update if I can, but if you don't hear from me, well, you'll know why. I work as a delivery driver for a local courier service, which means I spend most of my nights driving around town, dropping off packages. It's not the worst job in the world, but the hours are long, and the pay isn't great. By the time I get home, I'm either too wired to sleep or so exhausted I crash for half the day. One night, I was finishing up my last delivery around 1:30 a.m. and decided to grab something to eat before heading home. There's a 24-hour diner about 10 minutes from my apartment that I like to stop at when I'm working late. It's usually quiet at that hour, and the food is decent enough to satisfy my late-night cravings. When I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed a car parked in the far corner of the lot. It was an old, beat-up sedan with its headlights off, but the engine was running. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone was just waiting for a to-go order or taking a break. I parked closer to the entrance, went inside and ordered a burger and fries to go. The diner was empty except for the cook and the cashier, and the whole place had that eerie, too-quiet vibe that late-night spots sometimes get. I got my food, headed back to my car, and noticed the sedan was still there, engine idling. This time, I could see a figure sitting in the driver's seat, but the windows were too tinted to make out any details. I shrugged it off, got in my car, and started driving home. The roads were empty, and the only sound was the hum of my engine. About halfway home, I glanced in my rearview mirror and noticed headlights behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as I made a few turns, the car stayed behind me. It wasn't tailgating or anything, but it was close enough to make me uneasy. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe they lived in the same direction. But the longer it followed me, the more paranoid I became. Instead of driving straight home, I decided to take a detour through a few side streets to see if the car would keep following me. Sure enough, every turn I made, the car made too. My heart started racing, and I could feel my palms getting sweaty on the steering wheel. I didn't want to lead them to my apartment, so I decided to head to a nearby gas station that was always open. It was well lit, and I figured if anything happened, there would at least be cameras and maybe someone inside. When I pulled into the gas station, the car drove past without stopping. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a mix of relief and embarrassment for overreacting. I waited a few minutes just to be safe, and then started heading home again. This time, the streets were completely empty, and I didn't see the car anywhere. I told myself I was just being paranoid and tried to shake off the lingering unease. When I finally got home, I parked in my usual spot and sat in the car for a moment, finishing the last few fries from my bag. The street was quiet, and most of the apartment windows were dark. I grabbed my food bag and stepped out of the car, locking it behind me. As I turned toward my building, I froze. Parked at the end of the street, partially hidden in the shadows, was the same sedan from the diner. Its headlights were off, but I could see the faint glow of the dashboard lights through the windshield. Someone was still inside. My heart started pounding again as I quickly walked to my building's entrance. I fumbled with my keys, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The car hadn't moved, but I could feel whoever was inside watching me. I finally got the door open, slipped inside, and locked it behind me. My apartment is on the second floor, and I ran up the stairs, not stopping until I was inside with the deadbolt secured. I went to the window and peeked through the blinds, trying to see if the car was still there. It was. I could just make out the silhouette of the driver, sitting motionless in the front seat. I grabbed my phone and called my friend Mark, who lives a few blocks away. I didn't want to call the police unless I was sure something was wrong, but I also didn't want to be alone. Mark answered groggily, but when I explained what was happening, he said he'd come over right away. While I waited, I kept peeking out the window, my stomach twisting in knots. The car hadn't moved, but now I could see the driver's side door was slightly open. I couldn't make out any details, but it looked like someone was standing just outside the car, leaning against it. My mind was racing with worst-case scenarios, and I kept checking the locks on my door just to be sure. About 10 minutes later, I saw Mark's car pull onto the street. He parked right in front of my building and got out, looking around. I opened my window and waved him up, but as he started walking toward the entrance, the sedan's engine roared to life. The driver slammed the door shut and sped off down the street, tires screeching. Mark turned to look, but the car was gone before he could get a good look at it. When he got to my apartment, I told him everything. He stayed with me for a while, and we debated whether or not to call the police. In the end, We decided there wasn't much they could do, since nothing had actually happened. Mark offered to stay the night, and I gratefully accepted. I didn't sleep much, though. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that car sitting at the end of the street, its driver watching and waiting. The next morning, I checked the street before leaving for work, but the car was gone. I haven't seen it since, but I can't shake the feeling that whoever was in that car wasn't just following me by coincidence. I've started taking different routes home every night, and I always check my surroundings before getting out of the car. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I hope I never find out. I grew up in a small, quiet town in Vermont, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing much ever happens. In high school, my friends and I would often try to entertain ourselves by exploring the woods or sneaking into abandoned buildings. There was one place, though, that we always talked about but never had the guts to visit. An old, decrepit hospital on the outskirts of town. It had been shut down for decades, and there were all kinds of rumors about it. Some said it was haunted. Others claimed it was used for illegal experiments before it closed. We never took the stories seriously, but the place still gave us the creeps. One October night, my friends, Eli, Sarah, Jake, and I finally decided to check it out. It was a chilly, foggy evening, and the air smelled like damp leaves. We parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the way to avoid drawing attention. The hospital was surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence, and the main entrance was boarded up. We found a broken window on the side and climbed in, one by one. The inside was even more unsettling than I had imagined. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. Old medical equipment was scattered around, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the halls. We stuck together, using our flashlights to navigate the dark, crumbling corridors. After wandering for a while, we found a staircase leading to the basement. None of us wanted to admit we were scared, so we decided to go down. The basement was colder than the rest of the building, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. There were several rooms down there, most of them empty except for broken furniture and debris, but one room at the end of the hall caught our attention. The door was slightly ajar, and there was a faint light coming from inside. We hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The room was small, with a single metal table in the center and shelves lining the walls. On the table was an old, dusty journal and a collection of strange tools that looked like they belonged in a torture chamber. The journal was open, and the pages were filled with messy handwriting and crude drawings of human anatomy. Sarah picked it up and started flipping through it, but she quickly put it down, her face pale. "This is disturbing," she muttered. As we stood there trying to make sense of what we were seeing, we heard a loud crash from somewhere down the hall. We all froze, our hearts racing. Jake whispered, "Probably just something falling over," but none of us believed him. The sound had been too deliberate, too loud. Eli, trying to act brave, suggested we check it out. Reluctantly, we followed him back into the hallway. The sound had come from a room a few doors down. The door was closed, but as we approached, we noticed something strange. There were scratch marks on the door, deep grooves that looked like they had been made by claws. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to keep moving. Eli pushed the door open and we all shined our flashlights inside. The room was empty, except for a single wheelchair in the corner. It was facing the wall, but as we stood there, it slowly began to turn toward us. None of us moved. None of us even breathed. The wheelchair stopped, now facing us directly, and we could see that it wasn't empty. There was a figure sitting in it, slumped over, its face obscured by shadows. Sarah let out a small gasp, and the figure's head snapped up. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were hollow, black voids. It let out a low, guttural sound, and that was all it took for us to bolt. We ran as fast as we could, not caring about the noise we made or the things we knocked over in our panic. We scrambled back up the stairs, through the halls, and out the window we had come in through. When we finally made it back to the car, we were all shaking and out of breath. No one said a word as we drove away. To this day, we don't talk about what we saw in that hospital. I've tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, that my mind was playing tricks on me, But deep down, I know that's not true. Whatever was in that wheelchair wasn't human, and I'll never set foot in that place again.